Thank you all for joining us for our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. My name is Mia Burke, and I am Program Manager with Hanford Challenge. Hanford Challenge is a nonprofit based in Seattle that advocates for a safe and effective cleanup of the Hanford nuclear site. And one thing we do that makes us unique is we work closely with workers, insiders, and whistleblowers who have issues that are not being addressed. This is the 23rd webinar of our Nuclear Waste Scholar Series. If you're new to this series, we started it to inspire action and involvement in Hanford cleanup by inviting speakers to share groundbreaking scholarship, art, research, and experience working with nuclear waste. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Wenix Red Elk. Wenix is the Public Outreach and Education Specialist for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation's Department of Natural Resources Cultural Resources Protection Program. She's going to be presenting on first foods today. Just as a heads up, the presentation will be about an hour long, and we will leave time after the presentation for Q&A. So if you can't stick around for the whole time, feel free to leave. We will be recording the presentation and we'll share a link of the recording with everyone that registered. Thank you so much, Wenix, for joining us today. I will pass it to you to talk about your work.
Hello, my name is Wenix. It means that echoing through a mountain canyon as it rises from the ground. My last name is Red Elk, which is Wawokia Alpo. I'm a member of the Umatilla Confederated Tribes, but my bloodline goes back from the Cayuse, the Nez Perce, the Umatilla, the Colville, and I have a daughter who is Warm Springs, Wasco, Southern Paiute. We have a Ojibwe Creanist, and so we represent a lot of different tribes, as do many of our tribal members. Today, I will be sharing some information about the importance of our tribes out in Tokwata. When you're talking about first foods, you're talking about something that has come from the beginning of creation as it comes out of the earth and as it comes forward. And in the creation of all things related back to the earth and every connection that that has. In looking at that, our tribe, the Umatilla Confederated Tribes, has created a management approach using the tribal traditional ecological knowledge to be able to manage these foods across the landscape. And when looking at that, that includes part of the Hanford area because it is our traditional homelands and areas where not only my tribe has traditional areas in, and we still go up there and utilize them, but the tribes of the Yakima, the Nez Perce, and the upper tribes in those areas, because it was one of our main trade network areas in the place and the cultural significance to us. For some reason, it doesn't want to move. There it is. So today we're going to go over the importance of the tribe's culture and the understanding of that, the order of the first foods and the relationship to tribal culture in the landscape, and looking at the attention of the first foods, the ecology and physical processes that sometimes aren't recognized the way we recognize it to our people and the culture and the importance of it, and how that is important to be able to access those foods, to be able to practice our ways, and to be able to pass those to future generations, and how that applies to the landscape. When you look at the tribe, it's really important to know that we are combined of 3 tribes, which are the Walilapu, the Cayuse people, the Imatilam, which is the Umatilla people, and the Walulapum, the Walla Walla people. And they're from the Umatilla area up in Oregon, Walla Walla, Washington, and the Cayuse were from like the Pendleton area where the reservation is currently. That is what's known as Cayuse territory. When you look at this area, you can kind of see my cursor moving around down here at the bottom. You have the green area with the red line, which is the reservation, and it's a diminished border. And then you have what is the 6.4 million acres that during the tribe, when the treaty was signed in 1855 in the Walla Walla Valley, we reserved, meaning we had that 6.4 million acres was ceded, where we kept the ability to be able to use those areas within there. And that resides in Northeast Oregon and Southeast Washington. In those 6 million acres, we retained rights, meaning we kept rights we already had. We never gave anything away. So we still have those rights to be able to practice in those areas. And that reaches all the way up past Richland, Washington, up to the Columbia Point, as you see to the point of the top. And it reaches and comes down all the way past the Dalles. And then it goes all the way down towards Bern. It goes all the way, Burns, Oregon, then goes all the way over to Ontario. And then it goes all the way up towards the Stoughton County area. And so those are the 6.4 million acres. When we became the Confederate Tribes Union Interreservation, we also are a sovereign nation, meaning that we have the ability to act as a government and govern ourselves. When you look at treaties, if you look in law, it says treaties are what's considered superior rights of the land, because a lot of those treaties were signed before states and they were enacted. And so some of our rights that we have related to those treaties supersede state laws, because the states were formed after those treaties came forward. That's why our rights related to some of the fishing and the hunting, why they're so strong. During that time, they surveyed about 250,000 acres in 1859. During the Dawes Allotment Act, that was an act that came through that was land grabbing, and it knocked us down about 100,000 acres. The tribe today is currently working on purchasing some of that land back, and we use some of like the casino money to do that, and other forms of area to help us do that. We're actively restoring the land to increase the land base, and not only on the reservation, but important areas like the Wanakit over by Umatilla, and creating that into a wildlife reserve. We have acquired parts of the Army Depot, and we're putting that back into wildlife reserves, because there's some species there that need protecting, and you can't really do a lot with some of those areas. So just putting them back into reserves to protect. We also have lands up in the Dayton area called the Rainwater, where one of the main reasons we wanted that area was because they wanted to do restoration to restore some of the brown trout, and also to try to put some of the endangered species and some of the keystone species back in that waterway. But to be able to own that ridgetop to ridgetop thing, that was important of it, it was one of the main areas for the birthing areas for our big game, and especially the elk. And so they wanted to preserve those areas to help protect those species. So right now, our current membership is about, we have 3,190 tribal members at this moment. I had to check yesterday. We have about 30% are children under the age of 18, 50% about elders 55 and over, and half live on the reservation or near, but they also live worldwide. In the Treaty of 1855, underneath Article 1, this is the one that is very important to us. That treaty article says, provide also the exclusive right of taking fish. When you're talking about that, we're able to fish in a river as long as we're in the river, even if it crosses across private lands. We can be in the river walking to fish from that river to the flood bank. So we have to stay in it within that flood banks of that area. And a lot of people don't know that. As tribal membership, we do try, if we're in areas like that and we might be crossing, some of us will go to like a landowner and let them know that we're going to be fishing, we're in the river system, just because that's good practice. Sometimes people get upset about that, but when they don't know those treaties. And so one of the importance for us is to outreach and educate people of those rights, because they don't know them. And a lot of people don't talk about them. Streams running through the border said reservations hereby secured to Indians and at all other usual and custom stations in common with citizens of the United States. and of erecting suitable buildings for procuring the same, the privilege of hunting. We retained the gathering of roots and berries and pasturing our livestock on unclaimed lands in common with citizens, which was also secured at that time. We also have healthcare and other things that we have too that was set before in those treaties. When you're looking at the use area, the ceded area is just that main border, but we also have the Aboriginal use or the traditional use areas and the importance of those areas, because we weren't just staying in, if you look at this area, it has like a real dark brown. That's kind of that 6.4 million acres, but we were traveling into California. We were going to the coast. We were going to Montana. We were going up into Canada, and we have oral histories that talk about them going down and trading for instance, one of the elders was saying we would spend all that time making bags and digging roots, and then we'd go down the coast and we'd only get so many smoked mussels. And you know, they're talking about kind of funny stories about things that were being said or what was being traded for and amount of work for specific things. And so we still have a lot of stories. We even have stories of them talking about the mammoths coming across the land and coming across different areas that used to be underwater. So looking at the importance of that traditional ecological knowledge and our importance, because there's not a lot, we struggle to find some of our foods because they are in areas that are landlocked. So we have to work to create partnerships and relationships, not only on the open and unclaimed lands, but some places that those foods only live in areas that might be on somebody's property. So how can we create partnerships to help us access those foods, because we have a lot of foods that we haven't been able to go after due to that. When you're looking at Native American tribes, especially in the Tri-Cities area, that Celilo Falls was one of the biggest trade areas, like the hub, but Tri-Cities was too, especially at the Columbia Point. From there, from what I have heard and estimated, there was over 250,000 natives living along the Columbia, up and down all the areas. And my grandmother, who was born in the early 1900s, about 1908, she was telling me about being up in Tri-Cities area. And she said, there used to be so many salmon that ran up above in the Columbia Point that from bank to bank of the river, the salmon ran all the way across and you could walk across their backs. And they said at that time when they're running, the women and they would go in and they would selectively pick the ones that were kind of damaged and they would throw them up on the banks, and the people would be up on the banks and they would club them. And then after that, they would start processing. But they were able to walk in and selectively pick and leave the strongest ones in the river because there were so many of them. But this is just an example that shows kind of like the hub networks of, right here you see Celilo, but right up you have the loop of Tri-Cities along the Columbia, which was another hub. And at the end of the season, they would come there during the fall, they would trade, they would have the horse races, they would gamble, they would do marriages, and you know, they had a lot of they had to work together. And so that was another really main area for all the hub of those, and as you're coming up the river and going up. So when we take a look at our Department of Natural Resources and how we were going to manage our food, we look to protect, restore, and enhance the tribe's first foods out in Itapuata, looking at Chush, which is the water, Nusso, which is the salmon, Yamish, which is the deer, Kaush, which is the biscuit root, and Wewanu, which is huckleberry, for the perpetual cultural, economic, and sovereign benefits of the tribe. We accomplish this by looking at the traditional ecological knowledge, the knowledge of our people, and that cultural knowledge. We take their knowledge from their oral histories of what they heard from before, and also of them practicing now. And then we take, if we're going to do something like some type of scientific, say if we're going to do a roadway in an area, or we're going to disturb something, we look at what was those resources in those areas. That we have cultural sites, what are we going to be disturbing? Then we take the information of oral history from our people, and then we take their information and science, and then we try to make sure we combine them. We look at the population and habitat management goals and actions of those species and create natural resource policies and regulatory mechanisms to help manage those. Our tribes from time immemorial have been working to protect, restore, and enhance. When you're looking at there are several stories that kind of talk about the examples of that. One of the examples is, like I was talking about, the selective gathering of salmon when they're running big like that. Another one is when you're looking at, for instance, certain areas where there's a lot of weeds, they would burn, and they would burn even in the Tri-Cities areas. Around certain areas, they would move the fire and burn if something was not how they would be. For instance, like in areas where you had tules or different reeds, and if there was like springs coming out of there, they would go and clear them out of some of those areas that had maybe marsh, tules, different things to open up those waterways. When we gather certain foods, such as the wapato that gathers in that area, when we're gathering it, we're opening up the area and letting the water move and flow back and forth. And it's that interactive between people and the environment. We used to go up in areas such as that have huckleberries, and they would create fires after the season. They look at areas where the production was starting to become low, or the forest canopy was starting to encroach, and they would burn through those areas. And the whole entire village would do that. In the next few years, those berries would come, they'd be more productive, and it also opened up that canopy enough to let the big game into those areas and to create more nutrition within those foods and the resources that they would gather. When you're looking at how we look at the foods, it relates back to if you ever came to our tribe, we have different tribal feasts, and at those tribal feasts, we have the foods present in a specific way. And on our table, the foods are always set in the order of what we call tamanwa. Tamanwa is a natural law. It's looking at the law of creation when things first happen. And we recite things in creation stories, coyote stories. And one of the one that we talk about is how Creator first was creating all things in the world. And in the creation of all of those things, the Creator, he was creating all those things, and all those things were placed in one area. For example, at Rattlesnake Mountain, they call that Lalik, and that's an area like that. They gather in an area where all things were found. When all things were found there, you have the water, the fish, the big game, the roots, and the berries. They had a council in that area, and during the council of all the foods, of all the creation of all things, the Creator placed men and women. And in the creation of those things, all those things at one time were able to talk and communicate in one way or form. The salmon came up and stood testimony, and in that testimony it said, I would give my life for people in return. When I return to the rivers every spring, they will give back to us, and they will celebrate us. After the Nusuk, the salmon gave testimony, all the other species give testimony, all the way up from the eel, all the way down from the steelhead, the trout, the whitefish, down to the shako, the mussels. After that, brother gave testimony, and at this time they were talking to the men. Then all the animal species came up, and Yamash the deer stood up and gave testimony. I will give my hide for the drum, which represents the earth and the creation of all things and the seasonal round that we follow, that the foods grow in, and the heartbeat of all living things. Just like the earth has a tectonic pulse. After that, he said, I'll give my body for food, my hide for clothing. Then all the other animal species gave testimony. Then Creator said his 7 words of creation, and all those foods, all his creation turned to the women. Piache Bitterroot, she spoke first. She said, I will give my body to the people in return that they'll celebrate me also. And then she talked about herself. There are certain parts of her that are medicine for women, especially women that have babies and their milk's not coming in, to help with that. That was their vitamins, their medicine. Then after all the root species spoke, then the Wiwanu, the huckleberry, the oldest, she gave testimony. Then all the other shrub bearing and the food species spoke. Then out of all that creation turned back to the water, and the water said, I'm the first of all things. Without me, nothing will be here. I am the creation of life. Creator said 7 words of creation. They all turned around again, all the way back to the water. And the water said, in the end, I can wash everything away and clear it. And without me, you wouldn't be here. And so when we talk about this Tamanwa in this law, it's what we call the unwritten law. This is our first law. And then we have the other laws. You have tribal laws, tribal policy, state laws, federal laws. But Tamanwa is the law of nature. When you look at the law in nature, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. It never diverts that. It always follows that. The salmon are born in the streams. They stay there for about a year and then they head out to the ocean. And they're out there for several years as they mature, and then they come back and then they spawn and they pass away. They never divert from that. Creator at that time took their voice and gave it to the people. And then the people, it is our job to speak for them now and to always be there. And that's why they're so important to us. When we're looking at this order on here, you see them on plates because we do utilize them to nourish our body because they promise that. And in return, every year we have feasts to celebrate and to thank them for them coming back to us. And then when we pass away, our bodies go back to the ground. And then we nourish the ground that nourishes the plants, and then so forth, that energy of transfer. So we took that order with the mission statement and we lined it up with our programs. The water is the first of all things, so our water resource. Our fisheries comes next, lined up with the fish and all the aquatic species. Our wildlife program protects all the animal species. Water, fisheries, hunting also looks at all the water and the habitat related and the restoration, and they work together for that. We have our root-bearing species, including just the root foods and all root-bearing plants. The Wiwanu represents all the shrubs, from the low shrubs all the way to the overstory. First Foods incorporates all natural resources and what's related from the ground on up. Our range, ag, and forestry take care of those. Our cultural resource protection program protects the sites and anything in ground, above ground, and the importance and the relationship to those foods and the cultural practices of that. Our First Foods policy creates policies to protect those foods and also the treaty rights related to how we practice those. Our energy and environmental science programs look at the science related to that and looks at the air and everything related to those programs. So when we're managing in all components related to those natural resources, not only with science, but traditional ecological knowledge, which is science-based, but in our way, because we follow the timing. When you look at the foods, we already talked about the order, the water, the salmon, which is all the aquatics, the deer, the roots, the berries. And that order is a lot bigger than that. This is just a little snippet of that. When you're looking at this, when we come together and celebrate those foods. And this is us passing tradition down, where you see we have our worship people, the leaders of the men that are singing, and our kids that are learning. When we have the first food, when the food comes back to the land, we have to have a feast for it before we go and gather it. So the first one we do is the one for the big community, and then we do another one called the Children's Feast, where we go out and bring the children and they gather. Some of them for the first time, they have shadows. We have the bigger kids from the high school all the way down who are helping shadow them. And some of them don't know either, so they're learning at the same time. And then our elders and our families go out with the kids. Then they come back and then they have their own dinner. And so we're teaching them with their own dinner to pass that knowledge along. Because our children will be the leaders when we are gone. And we only have 300, 1,090 people, with 30% of that children from 18 on. So from 18 to the upper, those are the ones that have to be the leader. We don't have a pool of a bunch of people throughout a whole country to govern us. We have that little body, so we have to teach and train leaders to lead us. So this is, like I was talking about, the first foods. If you came to our ceremony, they put the foods down in the order of that cultural story. And so the first thing that goes on the table, we show recognition to those, is the water. So this table, the water would be each person sitting at the table gets a glass of water. And then after that, on the table, the salmon, anything that's fish species, they'll be in the area where you see those little plates going around. So the table will have the salmon. And then if it has eel, it'll be behind the salmon. If it has steelhead, they will be set on the table in the order that you harvest them. And so if you have all those foods coming in, the cooks will cook them in a specific way so they can recognize them. And then after the fish go down, all the other species go down. So the fish, the deer, the roots, the berries. Below you see down here, as this is you have historical images that show the feast then, and then you have our kids learning how to serve and then serving. And even though that it's an old tradition and it's passed on, some of us still eat on the ground, but we adapt to that also. Here's an example of one basin, which is the Umatilla Basin, where historically water flowed through. And at one time there was no salmon. We have worked to restore that. And so when you're looking at that, you have salmon and then the stations that go across. So you have the salmon coming through the Umatilla River and moving along the system where we've restored salmon and steelhead. And then you have, and we start in the beginning of the springtime to start harvesting those salmon. And then as you get into April and May and June, you can start harvesting the roots. And then you have the deer are up in the upper basin. And then towards August, you're starting to elk hunt, you're gathering your traditional berries, things like that. And you're at the end of the season, you're up in the upper part of the mountain. So we access from the low watershed all the way up to the upland mountains. So when we manage from the bottom of the watershed all the way to the upland. So we don't only manage just in our area, but we manage from the bottom to the top, because everything that comes to the top flows back down to the bottom. So looking at how a table and how that culture and the stories relate to that, it shows a table. And if you went to Longhouse, you see all the foods and they would all be lined up in that kind of like their ecological processes, where you have fish from the one that comes first to the end of its season to if you have deer and elk, the elk will be on the table first, then the deer next. Then if you had buffalo, it would be behind. And then they'll have them out in that line of all the food in the lines. And so when you see it, the foods are all lined up with fish, meat, roots, and berries in the order that they come in the cycle of the year. It's kind of complex. But when you're looking at interaction, and that's just one area, all of our foods don't come on the reservation, so we have to go out into those areas to harvest and gather. We have create visions to help us manage our foods. The Umatilla River Vision, which there's a link in the chat that goes to the document we have created to help us create a healthy river capable of providing first foods that's sustainable to the tribe's culture. The vision requires a river that's dynamic, shaped not only by physical and biological processes, but the interactions and interconnections between those processes. In this image above, you have every single waterway has specific components. You have vegetation on each banks. Right here, you have the channel that comes up in the middle of the little island. The water is hitting it, it's down flowing, it's cooling, and it's filtering as it moves through, and it comes back up a little bit cooler. You also, in this area, you have multiple, I think there's like 6 different springs that are coming in and out of there, feeding clear, clean water into those areas. And so you have a lot of dynamics that are going on there. You have downwelling, you have the backside channels that are slow, where if you have smoke, they're gonna wanna stay in those areas that are a little bit calmer so they can rest. So you have a lot of things that are going on there. So when we're looking at doing restoration on a waterway, we look at all those components. We're looking at the hydrology, which is how the water is moving and timing, the geomorphology, the connection, and the riparian vegetation related to that, depths, channels, segmented areas, connectivity of the channels and aquatic biota, what is living within there, riparian, so forth. And so that document, you can read more about that. We're kind of glazing over that so we can get to the Hanford stuff. So when we're looking at first foods, it also relates back to that creation story. We have to have the feast to be compliant in the promise we made in the beginning of time. So in early February, when the celery come, we have a feast. Celery grows right along the Columbia, right there in Tri-Cities, right there at the bottom. You have salmon feast, where we usually have it at Celilo. It used to be a salmon feast used to be where they would come up, but Celilo, they come up early, and when there was no salmon in the rivers, they started having it where they would come. Root feast usually at the end of April, May. Every reservation's different because of where they live. Their roots might come later or earlier. They had the feast related to when the foods appear in those areas. And at the end of the season, we have the Huckleberry Feast in July, August. So the foods also represent the ability for us to have ceremonies related to that. So when a young man first gets his first salmon, he'll have a feast for that salmon with his family, and they honor him as he becomes a fisherman. And then the big one is when they get their first kill. They'll bring that to the longhouse and they'll prepare that for a dinner. And then they will do a dance for him. And in the dance, they are recreating the story of his hunt. If he shot 3 times, they will show that he shot 3 times. They basically reenact it. And then he'll have a man that will stand up and speak for him. And he gives every single way that he went hunting with, his clothes, his rifle, everything. And by the end, people will give him bullets and they will come up and say words for him and honor him as a hunter. And now he becomes a hunter for the community. So if I needed some game, I would call Taipo. This is the young man. This is my boss's son. I would say, Taipo, I don't have no hunter. Would you be able to get me an elk, because I have nobody to hunt for you? If you do that, I might provide you some money for gas or something, but I need help. And he'll be like, okay, Auntie, I'll go out and try to see if I can bring you something back. And so they can be called upon. Once you become a hunter and a fisherman, you're that not only for your family, but your community. And then the girls, they go through their first digging and their first picking. And when they gather that for the first time, they also give all their clothes away, but they'll take their digging and give it to an elder, and so forth for the young woman who's the first picking. First foods are the center of our culture. We kind of go around all of those things that we do, and all the things cultural, the things that we wore, the weapons that we gathered, they were used for those things, and we were in tune with those practices of that nature. Also, but we also were conservative. We harvest in a way that makes that species more productive. When you gather willows and you gather things, you only gather so many, and you gather it so next year it comes back better. So we always harvest in a way that's sustainable. And if we notice people are over harvesting, we try to work to provide them, these are new areas you guys could go out to, and try to help them learn practices for sustainable harvests, for futures, because we want our plants and our animals to go on the land how they always had. Our people were more foragers. We weren't as much farmers are growing that way, because in our area that the animals are there, they're plentiful, and they're plentiful to the land as long as there's no tipping of that balance. So when we're looking at Hanford, why are the tribes involved in Hanford? One, it's part of our traditional use areas and those usual and custom areas, because of the ceded lands that we have from the Treaty of 1855. There are many sacred sites, and all those sites along the Columbia River up in those that have place names. So in this image here, you see where the river is coming and it loops up. It goes up towards past Tri-Cities, and it comes up to the point and around, and you see those names. This is just a little example of a few names, and a lot of them have specific areas where things were being done. That's what those names represent. We also have the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. We have the CERCLA Fund that covers the cleanup remediation. That means the cleanup of Hanford, natural resource restoration. And we have what's going on as a damage assessment to see all the damages that has happened in those areas that we used to access. And we are working towards making Hanford compliant, that you're cleaning the water, you're cleaning the land, so those toxins that are there and the pollutions that are there, that you have a plan and you're being compliant. If we see that they're not complying to what their plan, they could create a plan, but are they actually using it? How are you using it to clean? You have this many years and you have to meet these benchmarks. So the tribes make Hanford in those areas, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to clean those areas. Even if we're living in Pendleton, we're working to clean the areas there because of the importance and the resources there. There's some resources that are only found there. We have the nuclear waste policy affecting Indian tribes, which came in 1982. Department of Energy EM cooperative agreement with the tribe. We have the tribe's Hanford policy that was approved by the board by resolution 07009. The pre-1855 conditions or equivalent, meaning that they have to work towards cleaning it up. They might not ever get there, but they can continue to work towards cleaning it up. The protection of the river and the water and the salmon and those resources within there. And we are long-term partners and co-managers in those areas because it is part of our ceded territories. We have memorandums of agreement with Richland, Kennewick, Pasco, and all the ports. When you look at this picture, there was longhouse tents and villages up and down that river, all the way from the start of the Columbia all the way to the end. Our people have always been there. We were able to live successfully there and have a lot of foods and be able to access that. When we got pushed out of areas where those people always lived there. They gathered those resources there. There are certain plants and medicines that only are found there that we're not able to access at this time. This is a more condensed image that shows Tri-Cities, Hermiston, Walla Walla, Pendleton, and all the traditional areas that have names. And these are just the ones that we were able to document from the people that are still living and see all those names all the way up from Tri-Cities and beyond. We have always been here. Will continue to be here, and we'll always work to protect those areas and then make sure they're constantly being cleaned and more abundant, not only for tribal people, but for all the people that are living there. They deserve to have clean water too, and drink clean water, not have to worry about drinking some of this contaminated and give their kids cancer. The Hanford policy was adopted by the board 2009 that looks at the natural resources, cultural resources at Hanford and making sure those areas are protected and those lands are restored. Looking at cleaning and safe for tribal members' use and for the people within the area, and returning it to 1855 conditions. Like we said, we know that's with everything that happened there, but we can continue to work until every generation has to continue to make those areas cleaner. Our Hanford policy looking at future use goals. The number one is looking at long-term scientific capacity and looking at what does that look like in those areas and continuing to work on those goals. Hanford should not be further developed unless explicitly permitted by the tribe's board of trustees through government to government consultation. So if they're going to build something, they have to consult with the tribes. The CTR should get the first right of refusal for remediated land removal from federal ownership or transfer to another entity because of those 1855 treaties and the ceded territories, working toward being long-term partners and managers of Hanford lands and resources. My boss, Bambi Rodriguez, she works on, it's a list of Hanford working groups. Our cultural resources works on those groups. Our environmental science, our first foods policy. We have people that are working on Hanford issues every single day. Sometimes she's on the phone every day, all day. Right now, we have them over at meeting with them at Hanford of how they're looking at cleanup and creating better policies and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do related to the policies they currently have and making them compliant if they're not compliant. Proactively engaging and managing natural resources in those areas and cultural resources that are affected by Hanford. We looked at what type of activities are we doing and how are we being long-term stewards. The tribe has a field station that looks at environmental monitoring. We have analytical laboratories that is testing not only different areas and looking at air and looking at different plants that have to be replaced back in those areas, looking at botanical mitigation and first foods research, greenhouses, solar panels and nurseries. So they're looking at those different options, what's going on related to those areas. Review and comment of the cleanup process, looking at NEPA and the NARCA analysis reviews and comments, tracking and the support of off-site grouting initiatives, looking to ensure that tribal subsistence scenarios are used in the circular risk assessment, which means that when we're looking at tribal foods or resources related to that, when they're looking at that risk assessment, that they're taking in account of the way we're using things and the way we're doing things, of making assessment. You might make an assessment related to how you view it, but you have to use how the tribal people interact with those foods or those resources. You can't make a risk assessment without knowing how we're harvesting and doing those practices and that it's compliant and it matches those things. Looking at cultural resource monitoring and compliance, we go over there and monitor certain areas, or like you can have businesses that are building or they want to do something along the Columbia River. There's so many sites there. We send monitors to make sure they don't find anything that could be even an inadvertent discovery of like a person or a body that's there or a cultural site. And if there is, can it be protected? Do they have to shut down? So businesses have to send in something that says we're going to be we're going to open up the road and we're going to be digging down so many feet. Can you send a monitor over? So we go and monitor. We have natural resource damage assessments that look at the Natural Resource Trust Council, First Foods research to understand the impacts to the trust resources from Hanford contamination. And then we have First Foods focused restoration on those sites when they are damaged, or once they say they're taking something out and they repair it, then they have to look at what type of natural resources grew there before to put them back. You don't just plant any old plants that they think might look nice. It has to be related to those land sites, those areas, because our natural habitat from those areas, they grow there easily with those areas because that's where they're from. So our environmental science policy, which these guys provided me these slides just so I could talk about some of the projects that they're doing there. So they're working on first food sampling analysis of those samples related to those sites. They're doing a cactus study at Wanakit. They're looking at elk study with wildlife program near Lalik, 2026. Looking at what they find, such as metals, rad, other type of contamination. They have research goals looking at contaminant fate and transport, analytical method development, ion exchange based on passive samplers, invasive species and restoration research, development of tribal member scientists and technicians to be able to help do that work, looking at toxic reduction to the Columbia River, first food resource restoration in those areas and along the river, Hanford conceptual site models. So they're always doing things over there related to that and how to best monitor those resources. The Department of Natural Resource programs work on Hanford issues such as natural resource damage assessment. They're on the Natural Resource Trustee Council. The Energy and Environmental Science program is on the air quality. They have chemists, ecological lab technicians. We have a field station. So this field station right here is built specifically for them to do their research related to Hanford. They have the Cultural Resource Protection Program helps promote the protection, presentation, and perpetual and cultural significant places and resources for the benefit of current and future generations within those sites, especially related all across our territories, but within the Hanford area also. Some of the Cultural Resource Protection Programs working group participation, that means what our program does is they sit on the Pacific Northwest Site Office, Hanford Field Office, and they have two branches, the cultural issues and tribal affairs. So one's related to the specific cultural area. Tribal affairs is looking at all the different tribal affairs related. State and tribal working groups, Bonneville Power Administration, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Hanford Reach National Monument, Intertribal Advisory Boards, NPS Manhattan Project National Historical Park, and Hammer Tribal Subcommittees. And there's a current list of 5 more committees that are coming up that our Cultural Resource Protection Program will be on too. I luckily haven't had to be placed on one of those boards. That's a lot of stuff. So when we're looking at this, what is the importance of the cultural connection to the land? And this is where I come in. So the importance is when you look at this area like White Bluffs, they had villages out on this site, and even that white clay right there, they used to use that for certain things related to ceremonies. They used it for cleaning different hides. In areas like this, they might have special activities that were going on there, but how it relates to the water, the fish, the animals, and the berries, and for us to be able to go there and to harvest in areas, because we don't always have that growing in specific areas. Historical properties of religious and cultural significance to Indian tribes. When you're looking at this, it refers to TCPs. This is important for sacred places in the environment that have special meaning and or significance to tribal people and humans and communities because of the cultural connections that people have with those places and the practices and beliefs that they used to do or continue to do or have the ability to go back to do. In some of these areas, the importance of our prayer offerings of sacred places, in those usual and accustomed fishing sites or gathering areas, even looking at mineral gathering areas and how responds to the landscape of those features. So this is an area up on the lake that they were looking at when you're looking at traditional cultural properties, looking at fishing and hunting. And some of these were hunting blinds and how they were harvesting, resources gathering areas, trails, burial grounds, or places with legendary importance. Our people have always accessed those areas and the importance of making sure they're protected because they were there in history. And then we don't have wind turbines coming over and destroying sites like that that have cultural significance because they might have been prayer areas. When you look at Lalit, the land above the water, the reason why they call that the land above the water is because during the great floods that came in 15,000 years ago, during the Missoula flood, when that came in, the people had lookouts on those mountains. You know, they always had the lookouts kind of protecting. They seen the water like coming down, and so the people that lived in that area, they ran up to the top with their horses, the whole family. They moved as far as they could up on top of that mountain, and that mountain saved them from when the water came up because it was above. The water, you know, hit certain parts of that mountain. And when they looked at that, they survived that wall of water that was coming down because they were able to get out of there, and the importance of that area. There's certain things that grow in that area that are only found there. When we're reconnecting to the land, there's medicines there that only grow there. Here's an example when you look at, I'm holding different areas. So the little tiny root that you see in the far right side, that's called sesmitha. I had never ever seen it before. We call her roots and berries, we call her. The animal foods, we call him, the male species. So I had never seen her before until I went up there. And I know she grows in that area a little bit more, but our tribal people, we have other roots that grow in our areas. It's looking at the subsoils, the height, and the elevation. Some things only grow in certain places, and we don't always have access. So this spring, we went out on Lalit at the top, and because tribal people, we have the ability to access those areas, we were able to go up and look. It also has yellow bells. It also has this root down here next to the elk picture, and that one's a big seed lomation. I've never seen that one in those areas before, so we were really excited. It also has a very large elk herd that's been really able to reproduce in those areas. So we hope one day that we're able to go up there and to bring our people back to an area and harvest. And this is what I'm gonna say that's important to this. When we were going to the site, we called on a couple of our elders and asked them to come with us. One of the men in specific, when we picked him up, he said, I had a dream. And he had a dream of one of the leaders from the Wanapum people. And in that dream, he said, I had a dream that last night that Atwai came to me. I didn't say his name. Atwai came to me and he told me that when you go to Lalit, you have to be prepared. And he said there was fog. And he was walking out of the fog and he told them 4 things to gather before he went there. He said, and when you get up on the hill, you're gonna have to put them together. And then when you're up there, you're gonna have to find a certain spot and you're gonna put it there. And then you're gonna have to pray and sing. And so on the way there, when we were talking, he was preparing all these things that he gathered that he seen in his dream. And he goes, I don't know if I'm doing this right, but this is what I seen in my dream. So I'm doing it so I don't get in trouble. I don't know where I'm supposed to put this. And so we went up and we drove and we stopped at a certain point and then we walked. And as soon as we walked out to that point where he was standing, and when he looked down, the exact same thing that he was preparing from that dream was standing in front of him. And he said, I guess I'm doing exactly what I was supposed to do because look, there's another one right there. And so he got it ready and he put it down like he was supposed to. And then we sang. These places reach out and speak to us, and people that have passed on come to us in dreams and tell us, when you go up there, you have to be protected. If it's a sacred site, this is how you prepare. These places call to us because our DNA and our makeup is related to that, and that energy passes down from generation to generation, even in those DNA set and the importance of, you might not think something, but somebody came from a dream and told him, and he goes there and he finds exactly what he was supposed to put there. So it's important that we have access, because we can't find all of our food on our reservation. And this goes for all natives that have reservations. They can't find everything there, and they all have specific foods, resources, medicines that they have to go. That's why we have to go out into places to be able to find those. They're affected by climate change. We're working to form partnerships with people to help us with those, such as Wallowa Land Resources. They're working with us to find lands that we can go to, and also looking at landowners that give us access. These are important to the cultural preservation of our people. We work to tell our own people about our mission, how we're restoring and managing for them, how to identify the foods and find them, and finding areas where are locked and safe for us to bring our families out to. We're working to reconnect to foods. For about 100 years, we could not find wato, or we hadn't went out and looked for it. We reached out to Washington Fish and Wildlife and many other people along the Columbia and all different directions, and they told us where they seen the wapato. So this is that we all gathered up in a group and we went down to Richland, to the mouth of the Yakima. And this was the first, all of us that are standing here, this is the first time we had found it and seen it, some of us ever. We had only heard. So we went out, we gathered the Indian wapato. We were so excited. We had to relearn how to gather it. And then after that, we had it tested to make sure it was healthy for us to be able to eat. And then we brought some back home and we planted it in places to bring it back, because during that time when the treaties were signed and they're trying to move us to the reservation, they were going into the areas and they were burning them out and eradicating them. And also when the water flooded, it flooded some of those areas. And so we've had to search for them. After we found it, the second year, we worked with the city of Richland, and one of their members of their board came out. And so this is him digging with us so we could teach him about it. And then we created a memorandum of agreement with the city of Richland, and for us to be able to harvest back there. And when we first started, this whole waterway was all choked up. The water was stagnant. As soon as we started doing this for a few years, it opened up that whole channel, making it a better channel. The water was moving, it wasn't stagnant, and we were cleaning out what was in there too. So the animals started coming back to the area after 2 years of us going there. When you're looking at first food, it is climate change is affecting it. And so we're really working on creating we've created a climate adaptation plan focused on our first foods and how we look at it for us. The salmon in the Columbia, once it hits 71 degrees, they die. In the last few years, we have seen the influx and the heat of the winter water picking up. This picture of the salmon was a salmon that was passing through Bonneville Dam. It wasn't even in the upper part of the Columbia, and it's falling apart from the heat. In 2015, 250,000 sockeye died in the Columbia and Snake River because of the water is stagnated. It's not free flowing and moving fast. It just sets and heats. When you're looking at this, we don't see heat effects also just in the salmon, but one of our elders, Ramona Kiona, when we were gathering cedar root, you see me holding one right here, and right where my hand is, it had died in the middle. And she said, you know why it died? She said, in the year that the salmon bellied up because it was so hot, the cedar died in parts of it. So that's what you're seeing. So you don't see climate change just in fish. Cedars with their roots that are like 100, 200 years old, all the way down to the roots. It was so hot, it was penetrating to all the way down to the ground and into the root systems. And so you're seeing climate change even in the roots of some of these trees, and how our traditional knowledge people, they referred back to the year the salmon bellied up. When you're looking at contamination, or you're looking at climate change in Tri-Cities that year, I believe it was 2020, no, it was 2021, 2022. The last several years, there have been huge algae blooms in the Columbia along Richland and Kennewick, where I think several people have probably seen signs that says, do not enter the water. The water is toxic right now. Well, with the nutrients and the fertilizers and the things coming off the fields and coming into the water and the heat of the water, this dog, Charlie, was playing in the water that day, and he ended up dying, along with several other dogs that are animals that had got sick that was accessing the water. Even people were getting sick that year. And that dog died a few hours later after entering the water in Richland. So this is an example of that toxic algae bloom. You see, like, you have a lot of green here, and you don't see how green the water is, but when you see it, you can see it kind of move. And so because the toxicity was so high in the rivers, we weren't able to go back to gather Wappo for the last few years because we have to be safe. So we're looking at other alternatives to find other areas for us. When you're looking at climate, you're also looking at the big smoke events that we see across the whole landscape. This is an example of the Columbia and how it moves through. And once it goes to Columbia, it kind of sucks its way through. And then you have what affects those foods, because you have people that are going out and gathering and harvesting, and it affects the health and the lungs of all people from the whole Pacific Northwest and as far as that plume moves. For instance, our people, this is a picture of the Nichiwana where the salmon was inundating. And on this day, you could actually see the front of the bow of the boat. They said we had 30 nets in, and when we had those gill nets in, we had to go out in the smoke and we couldn't even see one person at the end of the bow. When those fishermen are out fishing, they're in that. The fish do not wait for us. When the fish are there, we are there to gather the fish. And you have people, that's their livelihood, is going out and fishing, gathering for their people, and they can do commerce out there certain times of the year. And some of them, that's what they do. And so it affects the health of our people. Me and my daughter weren't able to go down to the river that year because we have weak lungs and I had to protect us. So climate change affects the health of us. When we're looking at this, we're looking at how do we indigenize policy and economics, where we created an adaptation climate plan related to our tribe and how we use it. Looking at choosh water, surface and groundwater. Outnid Kakwata, looking at the first foods and the availability and how that responds to our people. Looking at our infrastructure and build and how does that affect us and how are we going to protect that? Human health and happiness, economics and community, the energy production and use that we're using, and how does it pertain to our sovereignty and treaty rights? Because we have those treaty rights and sovereignty, we can also help go after things that help us with climate change. How are we going to address that? So when we're looking at this, we also do public education and outreach, not only in our territories, but in the Hanford area, Tri-Cities area. So the work that I do is talking to people about us being over there, about Lalik, about the cultural resources, and all these foods that you see below in the pictures, they can all be found there. We do outreach to Benton Conservation District. We go and attend the Salmon Summit. I do talks like I am today. And then also let's talk about Hanford. I did last year with Washington Ecology. I do group talks with Hanford Youth Summer Camps, Richland Community Library STEM programs. I worked as a partner with LIGO as a tribal consultant and did First Foods presentation there at the opening and even helped them look at different things related to the importance of the tribes in those areas. I work at the WSU Richland campus and I give presentations there, presentations for the Audubon Society and some of the other, a lot of different churches too. We do some presentations for them, Department of Natural Resources, or Department of Energy. We usually do some type of outreach for the Native American month for their employees and staffs there. Basically, whoever calls me in, we try to address if I have the ability to do that. Our first foods are valuable and have been durable. Even through all the changes and the hardships, they're still there. Some of them need help when we're working to restore them, but we will always work to restore them because we promised them that when they didn't have no voice, we will be their voice to protect them because they gave themselves to us in the beginning of time. Even our women's foods, they still harvest huckleberries and they gather in a certain way. We used to do this practice where they used to be able to burn a log in the forest. We can't do that like we used to, but we can still adapt to doing a cultural practices, maybe just in a different way because there's different laws. We can't burn at a certain time, or it's so hot that it's damaging. If we light a fire, we could burn the whole forest down. So we have to, figure out how can we do cultural practices and also be compliant of what's going on with the environment. It's resilient. Even through the pandemic, we were still outreaching. We just did it via Zoom. We gathered foods and we had people come and pick up kits, and we were teaching them online, and they were cooking with us, learning how to make in this one, where they're learning how to make elderberry syrup to help them during the pandemic. So we were providing medicines to help them with everything that was coming down. And us being able to go out and harvest, even though through the pandemic, we were still able to harvest in a distance and be able to do those things. We're a first foods associated culture. We have to have the ability to access it, to harvest it, to prepare it, to be able to teach people, not only our own people, but others about what we do, to be able to share that with our community and to celebrate that. If something happens to one of those, it breaks those processes. First foods, physical and ecological processes. They have to have those for all of us to relate together. The first foods, when you're looking at justice of it, we have treaty rights that protect the water, protect the fishing rights, the hunting rights, the gathering rights. They have to be safe to eat and sustainable, and they're protected by the treaty. If they're not accessible, we have to find them and the ability to go out for them. And if something happens to them, we have the ability for the federal government has to help us protect those treaty rights because they gave those treaties to us in the beginning of time. Or we have a treaty that protects those rights. So kind of a end wrap up of food for thought. I need to move this down. The struggle has not yet ended. The deeds of such magnitude cannot be undone or over with. As many of you believe, they cannot stand alone in a period of time. Their tentacles reach out to oncoming generations and touch the lives of our people. We live centuries after the deeds themselves seem only echoes in history, which when you look at history, when you look at Hanford, this statement is very true to we are living and still dealing with what happened back then, and we will still be dealing with those for generations on. Maud Antone, who was our tribal chairwoman, she gave that quote, and we're still continuing to work towards those things. We're really working towards being able to restore those natural resources back to the landscape, not only on the Umatilla Reservation, not only in our ceded territories or Hanford, but beyond, so those environmental resources are always there. Those first foods are always there for our people. So our people can go out and harvest traditionally and culturally how they did before that treaty. We are not farmers, so we're not working to put it back and grow in that way. Plus, our foods take 7 years to develop in some cases, some of those roots. We want our young men to be able to go out and hunt and do that process of going out hunting, gathering it, taking it, cleaning it, processing it, and giving it to their tribal people. Only then can they call themselves a hunter. Or for a young woman who's gathering. Or call themselves a fisherman if they're able to fish in that river, gather it, prepare it, and do that whole process. That's just like somebody that is a heart surgeon. He can't call himself a heart surgeon if he can't go in, repair that heart, and that person lives. We are working to restore our cultural resources back to the landscape to fix ecological broken processes and to create a world that's better not only for our tribal people, but for all people that are living in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wenix, for your presentation. I so appreciate it. And there's others in the chat who are very appreciative of it as well. I encourage you all to please put questions in the chat, or you can also use the Q&A feature and I can read those off. We do have one question to start. It says, thank you for your presentation. How can we support CTUIR to address development projects that would pose risks that could add to contamination in addition to the legacy wastes at Hanford? So they're talking about the new nuclear development by bringing in risks and additional waste.
I know when it comes to those things that they're supposed to work with the cultural resources, our first foods policy, our environmental program, and with the board where we have a lot of people that reach out to our cultural resources and say, this is what's going to be going on there. Because of our programs are part of those committees, that hopefully that it would be brought forward. If there's something new, you'd reach out to cultural resources, first foods policy, of the upcoming projects for them to be able to work and address. And they work with the Hanford partners in those areas to see what those are. We do have contact people within cultural resources, or you can direct something to me and I could forward it on to those channels of where they should go. And I know in some cases our board of trustees have memorandums of agreement with Hanford in those specific areas.
Okay, thank you.
Some things I might not be able to answer correctly, but I could get you to the right place to go.
Yes, thank you.
When it comes to building, those things usually come into Tara Farrell Furman, and then she will ship them off to where they need or be able to reach out to people to see, this is what's going on, or this is the process. What the process is to checking in those things.
Okay. So we have another question. Would love to learn more about the plants and how they are used. This has answered many questions that I've had. How has the nuclear waste affected the plants?
Well, in certain areas, you have some plants that didn't ever really recover, but there's some areas when you go out to the Hanford site where you can see some of the plants that are out there because of the disturbance in certain areas like the Hanford Reservation, where you see that there's a lot of invasive species that have kind of come in. You have a lot of tumbleweeds too that are just have taken over, but you do have those other species that are there, like the big sage shrub, where those are some of the last areas of the big sage bushes that are out there. They're just massive out there, and they've been protected behind some of the reservation. And so there's just a lot of different things that are growing in areas. And I know with some of them, we have to, if we identify them, we can take them and have them tested, which takes 6 months or longer in some cases. They have to test to see, are they still contaminated? Mm-hmm. Is that area safe? Up on Rattlesnake, that's a pretty safe area because it's so far up. And even when things carried from the plumes and drop, that it's fairly safe in some of those areas. And so before they do gather, they will test to make sure. And so I think that as part of the environmental science, on the science side, they're doing all of the testing related, like right now they're doing the elk testing. They're also, I think that they also identified in testing like the elk that people were like, you're testing the elk in the meat, but you need to make sure you're testing like parts of the hoofs and parts of the bones because of how you might not see it visible in the upper part of the body, but it might be down in because of what they're eating too. So even like when you're looking at roots and plants, you have to make sure you're testing all parts of them to see where are the traces. Is it in the leaves? Is it in the bottom, in the root system? Especially the stuff that are older, because sometimes our roots, they can stay in the ground for year after year after year. They just go dormant, they come back, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. So how old are they and how long have they been around and what do they have? So I know when it comes to testing side, that's the environmental sciences area. And I know that we have our plant ecologist that works with them too, but then that area is so big that we'll continue to be doing that over time, and how are they going to address that later?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
That.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's very helpful.
Mason Murphy at Environmental Science. If you have a little bit more technical questions, we can get you into contact with him.
Okay.
CPIR Environmental Science.
Okay, so question about the risk assessments. Has Hanford revised the initial risk assessments to allow the use of first foods on site, or to include the use of first foods on site?
They're talking about how that's going to look like, and I know those talks are long. That's not an answer that I can say totally yes or no, but I know that they're working on those. I know that they're working on those, and it's still a long process. I don't know where they're exactly at in those, but they are working on those. My boss, she's constantly on the phone with them, and they have to look at different parts of it, like how it looks 50 years from now, 100 years from now. And I know there's stages. I just don't know exactly where the stages are, but they are working.
Okay. So we have part of the 1855 treaty says that farming/industrial practices cannot harm the ceded lands. Closer to home here in the Columbia Basin, the nitrate emergency must be of concern to CTUIR. So that's the first question. Is the nitrate emergency in the Columbia Basin of concern to the Umatilla?
I have heard them talking about that. That is an environmental science question right there. I know they have been talking, so it has been on the radar, and they're talking about how to move forward. I personally don't know where they're at in that discussion, but I imagine they're somewhere at the table because they usually are, or people usually at the table. And when you look at our tribe, we have our Department of Natural Resources has over 100, usually about 140 people, and we have a lot of different people that sit on those type of committees. But I know that the board, I want to think the board was talking about it, and they had them. I want to think that they had brought some information related to that, and I know it is on the radar. I just don't know exactly where because I do the outreach type of it. But like I said, that when it comes to those type of testing push, that Mason from environmental science and our first use policy, those would be a good, like if we ever wanted to do a follow-up related to more of the technical realm, more of the cultural side and the first foods, to be able to do a follow-up that has them being able to answer some of these questions of what they're doing and what they're seeing, and some of those more extensive areas where really to those type of subjects.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, can DOE make more of the Hanford site available to the tribes than they currently are? And can you also talk just about access? Like, how are you able to access the site? Is it open? Do you have to ask for permission? Kind of how that works?
whenever it comes to like rattlesnake or DOE or those places in the reserve, just like everyone else, we have to get permission. We have to, get badged. We go to the Capitol, everybody gets badged. We go do the check-ins, we pick up the badges and then, like, where are you going? Sometimes we have tour guides that bring us to certain areas if we want to go look at things related to our projects, or if we bring elders out there to do oral histories, to look at those places. Because sometimes when we're doing projects related to different, that maybe they're building something or they're cleaning something up and they're going to disturb the land, might bring elders out there that know about the area to talk about oral histories or what they see. Even me, they brought me recently out there to talk about the area, because when I was a young kid, when I was about 18, 17, 18, 19, I used to go out there and work out there on the Hanford Reservation, and we did some restoration projects. We did a restoration project at an EMSL site where they uncovered a burial. So we had to go and gather plants from a certain area and then bring it back and put it over the site where the burial was found. I also worked at the Hammer site where we were gathering different plants from the area and bringing it back to the site to restore that site after they had built there. And I think I was working with the Nez Perce tribe, but we had a tribal representative technician, like from each tribe, the Wanapums, the Yakimas, from Umatillas, from there. And so it's not only our tribe, but we all have different projects or work-related projects. We work there too, where you have people coming in every day for work, or when they want to access rattlesnake, they have to, call certain people, get a gate key, go out, bring it back. So it's not just, we can't just go out. We also know that how contaminated places on the area is, and that not all areas are great to dig in or be in, or what might be there, and how to just be safe, or what's going on there. When I remember when I worked out there, we were helping do some cleaning out one of those ponds out there, and we had to dig out basically in that cement pond. It had trees growing, it had rattlesnakes down there, it basically was a big swamp, and we had to dig out 4 feet of dirt in this huge cement container, where we were just tiny like this, and that the place is big. And so cleaning that out, we had to have access, but we were a work group, but we just don't have enough free prop. You got to check in. And sometimes they give you tags too, just to make sure, I remember when I was younger, the tags, they would have to bring them back, and they would check radiation level of those tags too, as we're working out there on the site, to see if we were ever exposed. And while I was out there, I have had recent emails saying that I did have some exposure, and that I do need to go and get some medical testing to see what I was possibly exposed to while I was out there. When I was about 18 or 19, I think I was telling Maya earlier that I was forming like hard cysts and stuff on my hand. I had sometimes where I'd have patches of hair fall out, as because we were walking over certain areas, and we'd be kind of sick. But over the years, our cultural technicians in the site that have worked on that area, I wasn't the only one who lost hair and had other things happen. And so, it definitely is a concern of the people who have worked out there. What were we coming across that? And sometimes we didn't always have guides, where we might have been in areas that we did have more exposure than not.
Another question is, are you familiar with other Superfund cleanup projects that are utilizing first foods consumption opportunities to inform the cleanup levels and remediation actions?
I know that not only our tribe, but all the other tribes that are part of, they sit at the table as our tribe does with Hanford, like the Yakimas, the Nez Perce, all those, and I don't know all the tribes, but I know that there's a Wanapum Cook. There's some specific groups that those tribes are all sitting at the table related to those resources. And I know that working with Fish and Wildlife and some of the other agencies too, that we've been having the concept of the first foods and looking at it like that for 15 plus years now. And I know the concept, even when you're working with our Fish and Wildlife, they'll be like, what are the tribes? I know you guys have first foods, so they know that we're working, and the concept of how we look at it is natural resources. First foods is like natural resources. Those foods and all those cultural materials, looking at the willows, looking at the cottonwoods, looking at those natural plants that have always grown there. And so I think anyone that does work related to habitat and plants in the area, they have to restore it back to those natural native species. So they are working towards the first foods because it is the same thing.
Okay, thank you. This was a fascinating presentation. Thank you. You mentioned that a key concern was to make sure CTYR and other nations with treaty rights have a say in development or land uses at Hanford. Has there been any discussion about the land back movement in relation to Hanford? Has there been some progress in federal and local governments understanding and respect consultation or consent around land use?
Those things are all happening. I'm not sure exactly what the levels, but I know that they've been talking about that for years and years and years. And I know that when in Hanford specifically, when some of those things move forward, that if some of those land backs are considered, that they would have to talk with the tribes first. And I just don't know where all that is. I can't say exactly, but I know those conversations are happening because I've heard they're happening. And I think they talked about what would that look like if it went back to tribe. Does a tribe have enough funding to be able to do, just looking, I know that's there. I just don't know where all that comes down.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, those are really great questions where if you guys ever wanted to do follow-up, capturing those questions, to have our technical people with, let's talk about the land back, let's talk about this and talk about that. And I know that my supervisor, she could have answered all these questions because she sits on all those boards. And so when we were talking about this, she was kind of giving me kind of the rundown, or she's like, there's a lot of things, and I know this is a big for you. And we really wanted to get that cultural side in on that. But if they want to reach out with those specific questions, they can email me and I can direct them to specific people related to that. But I know those conversations are happening.
Yeah, thank you. And we'd love to do a follow-up scholar series.
And some of those plans they're like 30 years out, 20 years. Where is it going to go once it is cleaned up? And I know that they're working on some plans now that discuss some of those. I just don't know how they all break down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you. Sounds like we need to do a follow-up.
Yeah, I say it'd be good. And I already told them that. I was just like, well, if we could just have some people like pitching, because I was a little nervous on not being able to answer some of those more technical. But I think it really opens up to being able to lead in something more that could be the follow-up in those technical areas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this was a great kind of starting point for all of us, I think. So thank you. I think one final question, what are your relationships with the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service? Do they coordinate their oversight with the Hanford cleanup and tribal rights?
I know that they sit at the table. I know that some of them are there too, because like you've seen some of those groups, the Fish and Wildlife, the Bureau. I know that when it comes to tribal ceded areas, open and unclaimed lands include the Forest Service lands and BLM lands are where our tribal members are able to go into to do those practices. And so when we're talking about those things, and I know they're doing that fish and wildlife big assessment over there at Hanford. They're doing a huge assessment, and they've been doing it for years. They've been doing it for a long time. And so I know those people are at the table. But when you're looking at Hanford, there's lots of people there and lots of talks, and they go slow and they take time. And some of those things that they want to move faster, and the tribes are holding them back because there's a lot of things that have to be addressed. A lot of assessments have to be addressed, looking at risk, making sure that nothing is left out, and then looking at how the compliance is going. You can't just write something and not comply. And then so I think sometimes they get far and then they have to step back, and the tribes will push them back and say, you need to look at this now. You need to look at this, or maybe they're not agreeing. And everything takes a long time, especially when you have something so massive and so many different entities with Hanford and the cities. You have Richland and Pasco, and I met Army Corps engineers, and you have so many people that are sitting at those tables, along with sovereign nations and federal. There's just lots of things to go over, and how that looks. But yeah, those people are there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that wraps up our Q&A. So thank you so much for doing this presentation and sharing all of this wonderful information with us.